At the beginning of chapter 11 in our Hebrew study, we're told that faith is the foundation upon which hope is built, and that faith convicts us of the reality of what cannot be perceived by the physical senses. Faith enables us to understand, as Paul brought out in the first part of chapter 11, it enables us to understand that God created the physical universe from material that is non-physical in nature, which means that all that is physical is a temporary projection from the realm of spirit. Faith convicts us that permanence can only be found in the true reality of the spirit realm. Those who possess faith, therefore, make the focus of their lives the pursuit of the spirit realm. It's not about the continuation of life in this present material existence. After establishing this background, the Apostle Paul began giving examples from the biblical record of those who lived their lives by faith. Now, we concluded last time with Rahab, the example of Rahab in chapter 11, verse 31. We're ready then today to pick up with verse 32. The Revised English Bible translates, "Need I say more? Time is too short for me to tell the stories of Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, of David and Samuel, and the prophets." So here he just sums up and says, all of these individuals that I've mentioned are examples of those who lived according to faith. Gideon, of course, remember Gideon's example from back in the book of Judges. Once Gideon was convinced by several miracles that it was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob who had appointed him to deliver Israel from the from the Midianites. We find that Gideon fulfilled, once he was absolutely sure it was the God of the covenant, that he then fulfilled all of the instructions that God had given him. By faith, Gideon obeyed God. He sent home 31,700 men and kept only 300 to use in driving the Midianites and Amalekites. God said there in the story in the chapters 6 and 7 of Judges that the Midianites, Amalekites numbered like locusts. It was just like locusts. There were so many. In fact, they had so many camels, it was like the sand along the seashore for the number of camels that they had come in on. So we're talking of hundreds of thousands of individuals, no doubt, that made up this army that had invaded and was in the land of Israel. And Gideon was supposed to get rid of this army with 300 men. That took faith to believe and trust that God would come to the rescue. And so Gideon is given as an example of faith. And then there was Barak. God used the prophetess Deborah to contact Barak and let Barak know that God expected him to lead 10,000 Israelites against the great army of the Canaanites commanded by Sisera. Despite facing enormous odds once again, including 900 chariots of iron, we're told, Barak went into battle trusting that God would deliver Israel, which again, indeed, God did. Then there is Samson. Samson was used by God throughout his adult life to begin the process of delivering Israel from the Philistine oppression. Whenever the need arose, by His Spirit, God provided supernatural strength for physical strength for Samson to use. Remember, the first instance we have is that he killed a lion barehanded. The lion came at him, and he took the lion and just killed him like a little lamb or whatever without any problem. He was able to run fast enough in order to catch 300 foxes, tie their tails together, and send them out, to spread fire throughout the grain fields, the vineyards, and the orchards of the Philistines. We also find that he's killed 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. Now, despite succumbing to the wiles of Delilah because of his human weakness, Samson knew that God was the source of his supernatural strength. When the time for the optimum amount of damage that could be inflicted on the Philistines finally arrived, remember, all of the lords of the Philistines, over 3,000 people had gathered at the temple of Dagon. Samson at that point trusted God to supply him with the strength needed to accomplish God's will for him. And God honored his faith and restored the strength Samson needed in order to bring down that temple and to destroy over 3,000 of the leaders of the Philistines. Then we have Jephthah mentioned. Jephthah's faith was exhibited when he clearly spelled out to the king of Ammon that he believed the promise God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that the land of Canaan belonged to Israel. That was a state of faith. He trusted that that was true. His faith was also revealed in the trust that he had in God's power to provide victory for Israel over the Ammonites. So once again, God worked through these individuals. They trusted God because they always went into battle far outnumbered in any of the situations that we read about in the cases, especially as we go through the book of Judges. Now, David is mentioned, and of course there are all kinds of examples that we could go to regarding the faith of David. Yet the primary example of David's faith was his unflinching trust that God, who had provided him the strength to kill both a lion and a bear, would also give him victory over the Philistine giant Goliath. And of course, that's one of the all-time greats among Bible stories, is what David was able to accomplish. A perfectly placed stone, a man, a giant, fully armed, and only one spot basically that death could ensue was right in the forehead, the only place unprotected virtually, and David's stone went there, no doubt guided by God. But David trusted God. That was his faith. And then we have Samuel mentioned. Of course, all of Israel, you read about Samuel, all of Israel was drawn to Samuel by the things that he taught as the result of his faith, his confidence and trust in God. And then Paul finally mentions, and the prophets. So rather than deal with each one of the prophets, he simply lumps them all together as men in whom faith resided. Because all of the prophets had faith. They had trust. They had confidence in God. Even Jonah. Jonah ran off. Because Jonah knew God would do exactly what God was going to do. And he didn't want God to take care of the Assyrian Empire. Or he wanted the Assyrian Empire destroyed. He didn't want God to step in and rescue them because that meant, trouble upon Israel. And so all of the prophets had trust and had faith in the Almighty. Now, we move on then to verse 33, after this list of individuals who through, or by, some translations have, who through faith subdued or conquered kingdoms. Some translations have conquered. They either subdued or they conquered kingdoms. Now, including the ones we just read about, we could throw in Moses and Joshua, because they also were individuals that achieved victory over the enemies of Israel. They subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, or some translations have administered justice. Most of these individuals that are mentioned here, and we could include other prophets even that would come later, most of them, like David, administered justice during the time that they ruled in Israel. Samuel clearly worked righteousness during the time that he was a prophet and a leader over Israel. All right, and it goes on, worked righteousness and obtained promises. Like the patriarchs, due to pleasing God by his exercise of faith. David, God said, is a man after my own heart. and he was a man after his own heart. And again, that was because of pleasing God, due to his faith, his trust. And because of his faith, David was selected by God to be the recipient of unconditional promises regarding rulership over Israel by his descendants. He would never lack a man to sit on the throne. And so that when we come to the millennial reign of Jesus Christ, even at that time, Israel will be ruled over by a descendant, a physical descendant of David. Going on in verse 33, stop the mouths of lions. Now, beginning here at this part of verse 33, Paul uses three examples that connect the possession of faith to deliverance from certain death. It's certain death when you've got a lion coming at you that's hungry. There is no human being that has the strength. God provided strength for at least two individuals that we know of, Samson and David. Both of them were able to stop the mouths of lions simply by being given the power, the strength physically to kill the lion. So their mouths were stopped. But again, we think of stopping the mouths of lions, we think of Daniel. Due to Daniel's faith, his trust, his confidence in God, God delivered him. He protected Daniel during the time that Daniel was in the den of lions, and he did this by supernaturally shutting the mouths of the lions. They were incapable of opening their mouths. Apparently, they also were incapable of using their claws because Daniel was able to survive the night in the den of lions. Verse 34 then, the New American Standard translates, quenched the power of fire. So by faith, there were the mouths of lions that were stopped, and the power of fire was quenched by faith. That, of course, is referring to the three young Jewish men that were with Daniel in Babylon. Due to the faith of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, whom we know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, God supernaturally protected them from the power of fire while they were in the Babylonian furnace. They came out and not even the slightest amount of smoky aroma was on them. They were totally protected from every aspect of the fire because of their faith. They told Nebuchadnezzar, if it's God's will, we'll survive, but regardless, we will not. If it's our time to die, it's our time to die, but we will not bow down and worship you or your image or any of the other things. So they trusted, they put their lives in the hands of the Almighty, and the power of fire was quenched. And then verse 34 goes on in the New American Standard, and escaped the edge of the sword. When Ahaziah, king of Israel, sent two separate detachments of 50 men plus a captain, you will remember back in 2 Kings chapter 1, sent them armed in order to apprehend Elijah. And Elijah, because he had faith in God, well, if I am a man of God, may fire come down from heaven. And one group was roasted, and a second group was roasted, but nobody even thought about lifting a sword against Elijah after that. Then we have the story of Elisha, same situation. When the king of Syria came to take Elisha, because of Elisha's faith, God responded to his request, and God blinded the entire Syrian army so they couldn't see. And Elisha led them into a town where they were held captive by the Israelites. They were fed, and then they were let go to go back to their homeland. But nonetheless, the king of Syria wanted Elisha put to death because he kept telling the king of Israel what was going on, the king of Judah what was going on. And he wanted him dead. So again, they escaped the edge of the sword, these individuals did, and there were many others that we could list. Verse 34 goes on in the New American Standard, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war or mighty in battle. put foreign armies to flight. Gideon considered himself the least in his family. He was the least of all the members of his family, and his family was considered to be from the weakest clan in the tribe of Manasseh. Yet because Gideon believed God, he became strong when he trusted God to overthrow the Midianites with 300 men. In his weakness, Samson called out to God while he was tied between the pillars of the temple of Dagon. He cried out to God, trusting God to supply him with the supernatural strength necessary to deal a major blow to the power of the Philistines, which is what God wanted, and God directed events so that Samson would be exactly where he needed to be at that time. Verse 35, women received their dead raised to life again. God honored Elijah's faith by intervening and raising from the dead the son of the widow of Zarephath. Remember, Elisha went in and laid over the body of the boy several times, and then God restored his life. So that woman, it wasn't the widow of Zarephath's faith, it was Elijah's faith that was made possible the resurrection of her son. And then with Elisha's faith made possible the restoration of life of the woman's son, that is, the woman of Shunem, the Shunammite woman. Remember, she was barren, and she went to Elisha and asked the man of God if he would importune God so that she could have a child. And she did have the child, and after the child was several years old, the child died. And so then she came to Elisha again. But Elisha trusted God that God would raise the child up, and in the same manner did so. So women received their dead raised to life again. Now, after covering many examples from last time and the ones we've gone through this morning so far, after covering the many examples of miraculous interventions and deliverance from certain death of those with faith, Paul now begins giving us, in the beginning here in verse 35, the middle part of verse 35, he begins giving examples of how others with faith found no deliverance. The fact is, they suffered painful deaths, just as did Abel, the very first example of faith given in this chapter. Abel, the very first one, met his end by being murdered. Verse 35 goes on, and others were tortured. There were some raised to life again, who were resurrected from the dead back to physical existence, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance. They were intent on holding on, and if it cost them their lives, that's what it cost them. Now, this could refer to a number of individuals who refused to compromise God's way under the threat of torture through various methods that resulted in excruciating deaths during the time that Antiochus Epiphanes attempted to stamp out the followers of God in Israel. Antiochus Epiphanes, remember, came in and he tried to Hellenize all of the area of Judea so that he prevented circumcisions from taking place. He was requiring the people to eat unclean meats, etc., etc. And so he was doing all he could to stamp. Of course, the devil was the one behind it, trying to prevent a culture, a society, a community that Jesus Christ could be born into as a child and be reared without compromising any of God's way and God's law. But there were horrible things recorded in the book of the Maccabees about what happened during that period of time to individuals who were very faithful to hold on to God's truth, that they might obtain a better resurrection. So they held on, not accepting deliverance, because they were looking beyond this life. The first resurrection is the better resurrection because it marks the time when entrance into the realm of spirit actually occurs. It's the realization of the hope provided by faith during life in this physical realm. Sometimes people get the wrong impression of the purpose of faith. The purpose of faith is not for seeking continuation of life in this flesh, in this realm. That's not the purpose for faith. There's some who think it is, but it isn't. The purpose of faith is to make certain that the journey of our lives is in conformity with God's will, so that we reach the destination of eternal life. That's the purpose of faith. So sometimes there's a miraculous intervention, and sometimes there isn't, and nobody can point the finger and say, well, that person died because they didn't have enough faith. That goes contrary to what we read in Hebrews chapter 11. Verse 36, complete Jewish Bible. Others underwent the trials of being mocked and whipped, then chained and imprisoned. Again, we could look at what happened during the Maccabean period. Read it in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. I mean, the historical record is there. We don't have it recorded other than one or two verses in Daniel 11 that even alludes to that. But as far as the specifics, there are specifics given there. Now, when it talks about others, the prophet Jeremiah was certainly one that would fit into this. He was beaten. He was imprisoned due to his faithfulness in delivering God's warning before Jerusalem was overthrown by the Babylonians. And because he was faithfully giving that message, he suffered persecution from the people that lived in Jerusalem. So others underwent. He was certainly one that did. Verse 37, they were stoned. Well, the prophet Zechariah, not the one that we have the book Zechariah in the Minor Prophets, but Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, who was the priest, was stoned. That Zechariah was stoned. Jesus mentions him in Matthew chapter 23. From righteous Abel to Zechariah, who was stoned right there in front of the temple. He was stoned after faithfully delivering God's message in the days of King Joash of Judah. And then they were stoned. We could also include Stephen, because after he gave faithful testimony against the Jewish religious leaders for rejecting and killing Jesus Christ, Stephen was stoned to death. So, they were stoned, they were sawn in two, because Isaiah was faithful in delivering God's warnings to the kingdom of Judah. According to tradition, King Manasseh ordered him to be sawn in two. And so the man who wrote what today we would call 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and the major prophetic work of Isaiah was, despite his faithfulness, despite his service to God, was sawn in two. They took wooden saws, according to tradition, and sawed him in two, basically disemboweling him, and he died an excruciating death. They were sawn in two. They were tempted. Many of those who were killed were killed after being tempted or enticed by the faithless. The faithless, those who were putting them to death, did everything they could to get them to denounce God, to renounce their beliefs in order to save their own lives, or sometimes they would bring family members in and say, I'm going to put them to death unless you recant. And they didn't recant because they saw again on beyond the present. So, some were tempted and were slain with the sword. Elijah and Elisha escaped being slain by the sword, but many others did not escape. Remember Jezebel, ordered the killing by sword of many of the prophets of God during the days of Elijah. You can read about that in the closing chapters of 1 Kings. And so there were many slain by the sword then. John the Baptist had his head cut off by a sword. So he also died by a sword. Verse 37 goes on, they wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, or the complete Jewish Bible says, persecuted and mistreated. This was the lot of Elijah as well as John the Baptist. They both were individuals who were pretty much living in the wilderness and from place to place. So they wandered about, and they didn't have a lot. Destitute, afflicted, tormented. Wandering, verse 38 goes on in the complete Jewish Bible, wandering about in deserts and mountains, living in caves and holes in the ground. Now, Paul seems to be making allusions here to some of the history of the Maccabean period again. There were individuals mentioned in the book of Maccabees, such as Mattathias Maccabeus and his sons. Judas Maccabeus was the most famous of his sons. And the fact that they were required to live kind of guerrilla-style lives during the time of the rule of Antiochus Epiphanes, and they were the ones that worked against him trying to completely Hellenize Judea. Now, that's one way to look at this, wandering about, living here and there and wherever. But this, verse 38, could also, first part of this, could also be a summary of the lives of the majority of those of faith. The majority of those with faith are no names. They were insignificant. They went unnoticed by humanity during the time they lived. They simply were not known. Moses was known. David was known. There were those, their renown goes all around. I mean, David killing Goliath, there is faith. That's a recognized individual. We don't have any of the names of the prophets of God that lived in the time of Elijah, other than Elijah and then Elisha, who seems to have been maybe one of the prophets of God, who then inherited Elijah's position after Elijah was taken by God to a different part of that area, that region of the world. Going on in verse 38, the complete Jewish Bible has, the world was not worthy of them. Those of faith were ridiculed, persecuted, even killed by the faithless of this world, of this cosmos, this present arrangement. Those of this world whose focus is only on the physical realm. Those who are, if you will, the children of the devil, as Jesus called them in John 8. You are of your father, the devil. Well, those of this world whose focus is only on this physical realm and what they can take from this physical realm, they refuse to accept the existence of those whose focus is on the realm of spirit. Yet, rather than the faithful not being worthy of living among those without faith, it is the faithless who are unworthy of having the faithful present among them, according to what this says. The world was not worthy of them. We're not worthy of these individuals who had such trust in God, because it's so contradictory to the type of mentality of those in this world. And all these, New American Standard goes on in verse 39, and all these, having gained approval, or the New King James has, having obtained a good testimony through their faith. Now, almost every individual listed in chapter 11 lived during a time prior to the institution of the new covenant. All who lived prior to Moses lived even before the Sinai covenant was established. Yet, regardless of when they experienced physical life, they all, we are told here, whether under the new covenant, under the Sinai covenant, or under no covenant, as far as an important covenant except a personal covenant between them and God. They all, everyone, gained God's approval because they sought to be obedient to His will. That's what gains God's approval. That's why David was a man after God's own heart, partially. The other was, when he was shown he was wrong, he repented very quickly. All right, so these all gained approval. They got a good testimony through their faith, did not, going on in verse 39, New American Standard, they did not receive the promise. Despite the belief and trust in God they possessed, none of those who have died in faith have yet obtained the promise of entering into the realm of spirit, into the city prepared by God, which we read earlier here, back up here in verse 16. None at this point have entered. Now, even though not one of all of the faithful who have already died or will yet die before the first resurrection has yet acquired, though they have yet to acquire the promised inheritance, they will indeed receive it in their next conscious moment. They will have no awareness of the hundreds, thousands, or maybe just a few months that exist between their deaths and the return of Jesus Christ. It's as good as done, but it's just it hasn't happened yet. That's what he's saying. Verse 40, the Complete Jewish Bible has, because God, the reason they didn't receive it is because God had planned, note, had planned. This has already had been planned out long before, had planned something better that would involve us, so that only with us would they be brought to the goal, or made perfect, the New King James has. As outlined in the 7 annual festivals, God's plan requires that the first children born into His family, who will become joint heirs with Jesus Christ, Romans 8 tells us, all enter that inheritance together at the first resurrection. They all, being joint heirs, receive it at the same time. That's the way it is laid out in the plan of God through the festival seasons. Chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, or the New Living Translation says, by such a huge crowd of witnesses. All of the individuals mentioned in the previous chapter, in chapter 11, testified by their lives that all individuals who are selected by God can persevere, not may, but can persevere through any type of human experience if they live by faith. Any type of horrendous event that we can think of, people of faith have already gone through it. Nothing new under the sun. Having faith, having complete trust in God, and performing His will is what must be done. And that's what they did. So, we're surrounded. Since we're surrounded by so huge a crowd of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance, Goodspeed has, with determination, the race that is set before us. We're asked to reflect on the examples of those who lived by faith, and then consider that they have successfully completed the race of life. They have finished it, and they did it successfully. We now, like they in the past, those here in chapter 11, we find ourselves weighed down with the burden of trials at times and slowed down by obstacles because of sin at other times. Like those who endured to the end of the race of life, we too must persevere patiently in faith until we cross the finish line of our personal races, which is the end of our personal lives. We've got to persevere all the way. It's like when we come to Jesus Christ and the time of baptism, you must take up your cross. That means it is an activity that begins at the moment we receive God's Spirit and does not end until we draw our last breath. We are under obligation. That's the race. Looking unto, or the New American Standard has here in verse 2, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher, or pioneer and perfecter, some translations have, of our faith. Just as all of the faithful who during their lives looked beyond the physical to God in the realm of spirit, so we must not become distracted by this world, but rather steadily focus our gaze, as it says here, on Jesus Christ. He is the beginning, the author and finisher. That is, He's the beginning and the end of faith. He is the summation, if you will. He is the only perfect example of faith that we have in the Scripture, because He's the only perfect example of faith that has ever been. Although every individual listed in chapter 11 was commended for faith in various areas, not one of them was always perfect in faith and obedience, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Romans 3:23 tells us. Remember, even Abraham, who is always looked at as, kind of the pinnacle of faith. We look at Abraham. Abraham, Sarah's going to have a child. Abraham laughed. All right? So it wasn't perfect there. He had to kind of think it through. God can do anything. And of course, he learned his lesson because there was no problem as far as taking the knife in order to kill Isaac later, because he knew then. But he still stumbled. And every human being does. Jesus Christ never did. Who, it goes on here in verse 12, or in verse 2 of chapter 12, who for the joy that was set before him, or was awaiting him, some translations have, he endured the cross, or better in the Complete Jewish Bible, he endured execution on a stake, despising the shame, or disregarding, some translations have, its shame, that is the shame of the stake, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus Christ set the perfect example of looking beyond this physical realm, the way He lived His life. He looked beyond His life in the physical realm throughout the entirety of His physical life. From the time that He was a child until the end of His physical life, His focus was always fixed on doing the will of the Father, so that He could enter into the realm of spirit. Remember when He was 12 years old? Family was going home from after Passover and unleavened bread. Where's Jesus? Nobody could find Jesus. Then they had to go back to Jerusalem. Here He is at the temple, and He is talking, discussing Scripture, dumbfounding the rabbis of His day. And He said, well, why are you looking for me? I must be about my Father's business. His mind was always focused on that from the time that, again, He was a child. That's the example He gives us until He draws the last breath. It's always looking beyond. Because of His faith goal-based focus. Nothing ever distracted him from his goal. He never wavered during his execution by blood loss while nailed to the stake like a common criminal. And he didn't because he was convicted that after his death, his Father would raise him up and restore him to immortality. He was confident. That's the faith of Jesus Christ. His faith was fulfilled, and now he resides in the permanency of the spirit realm, as it says here, at the right hand of the throne of God. He is our example. Verse 3, the New American Standard goes on, "For consider him who has endured such hostility," or some translations have opposition, "by sinners against himself, so that you may not grow weary and lose heart." As we run the long-distance race of living out our lives, we must, Paul is telling us here, we must stay focused on the example set for us by Jesus, by our Savior. Due to being focused on the non-physical realm, Jesus never desired to be part of this world. There was nothing about this world that was attractive to him. Therefore, he was hated and was attacked by those without faith who were of this present evil world. Remember John chapter 15. He told the disciples, world has hated me, they're going to hate you too. They hate me because I don't have any part of this world. I don't want any part of this world. And the more you don't want to be part of this world, the more it's going to hate you as well. That was the warning he gave us in John 15. So he was hated, he was persecuted. However, he persevered and he never gave in to their attacks. In order to finish the race, we must emulate his patience and endurance whenever we encounter any opposition from the faithless of this present world. Verse 4, going on in the New American Standard. "You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood." Or as the New Living Translation brings out, "You have not yet given your lives in your striving or your struggle against sin." This applies to everyone who reads this letter. For their lives have not yet ended. You can read, you're still breathing. Paul reminds the readers of this letter that many of the individuals cataloged earlier were put to death because they refused to be forced into defiling their faith. They adamantly said, "No, I will not recant, I will not renounce the God that has given me life, or His way that He requires in order for me to receive life in the realm of spirit." When we, and any of the readers of this letter, compare our personal situations to what those of old suffered due to their possession of faith, and to what Jesus Christ voluntarily submitted Himself, so that the chosen of God could become recipients of faith, they and we have no excuse whatsoever for becoming weary and growing faint, of losing heart. You've not yet resisted. What was done by Jesus and what was done by the faithful listed in chapter 11, who now wait in the grave for what they saw beyond this physical life, make it clear that the faith of Jesus Christ that we are to have can enable us to successfully endure whatever suffering we may encounter. Because they did it, Jesus Christ did it. It can be done. Requires the faith of Christ. Verse 5 and 6, the Revised English Bible has, You have forgotten, or Moffat phrases this as a question. And have you forgotten? Either way, it makes sense. Okay? And have you forgotten the exhortation which addresses you as sons? My son, do not think lightly of the Lord's discipline, or be discouraged when He corrects you. For whom the Lord loves, He disciplines, He chastises every son whom He acknowledges. Now, the original reason for this letter was to correct doctrinal misunderstanding on part of the Jewish readers of, and I should say Jewish members of the church. Those, again, it was written primarily initially to the Jews, because we look at this as being the letter that Peter refers to in 2 Peter chapter 3, that was written to the Jewish community. So it was written originally to them, Jewish members of the church, who were failing at that time to comprehend the magnitude of the supremacy of Jesus Christ in every detail concerning salvation. You know, they were still thinking they needed to participate in these sacrifices, and it was not necessary. The supremacy of Christ, He fulfilled those sacrifices. Now, the purpose for this section of the letter could have been to remind its original recipients to receive the correction given in this letter as if it was coming directly from God. Today, now that the letter is established as part of the Holy Scripture, by faith we know God is speaking to us through this letter. There should be no question in our minds that God is speaking. He inspired this material that the Apostle Paul wrote. Now, here Paul calls attention to the passage in Proverbs 3, verses 11 and 12. This is what he's more or less paraphrasing. And he does so as a reminder that some of the trials and difficulties we encounter as we run the long-distance race of life, some of these problems are due to our need to be corrected. We need correction. We need to be disciplined. When hardships come, rather than feeling that God has deserted us, as people often do, we need to seek God to help us comprehend where we failed as His children, how to correct our failure, and what we need to learn from the circumstances we suffered. And that's what Paul now is going to be explaining. Verse 7, New English Translation. Endure your suffering, or your trials, New Revised Standard has, as discipline. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there that a father does not discipline? We're to keep in mind that God loves His children and keeps a very close eye on His children. You know, He is not a negligent parent whatsoever. You know, He who has begun a good work in you will see it through. So He keeps His eyes on us. If His children wander away from Him into a spiritually dangerous area, He will correct them. He'll tell them to get off the railroad track, get out of the street, get away from the edge of the cliff. He will do that because He is a hands-on parent. When corrected, His children are not to pout or feel sorry for themselves. They're to acknowledge that they needed correction from their father and meditate on how to alter their conduct to prevent creating any other misconduct in that area. This is what he's telling us. For what son is there that a father does not discipline? Verse 8 going on in the New English Translation, but if you do not experience discipline, something all sons have shared in, then you are illegitimate and are not sons. Now, all children make mistakes. Some make more mistakes than others. Therefore, all children, regardless of whether they make lots or a few mistakes, they all need correction. Some need correction more often than others. Just as children look to their fathers, we could say parents, just as they look to their fathers to provide for them and to instruct them, so they expect to be disciplined by them. Anyone who never receives correction is like a child who's been abandoned by and is possibly even unknown by its father. You know, illegitimate children, a lot of times the father is totally unaware of the connection that, when it happened. Doesn't know anything about the child. All right, well, anyone who doesn't receive correction is like that. Now, spiritually, such an individual has never been begotten by the Father in heaven, and therefore has not received the promise of inheritance, does not standing in line with other joint heirs for the possession of that inheritance. Paul is emphasizing here in verse 8 that a proof of our place in the family of God is that we receive correction when it's necessary. That's the point he's making. Now, going on in verse 9, the Complete Jewish Bible has, furthermore, we had physical. The New King James has human. We had physical or human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. How much more should we submit to our spiritual Father? New King James has the Father of spirits, and live or attain life, the Revised English Bible has. We're reminded here of the need we had of correction when we were children under the authority of our human parents. And we're shown that as a type of the correction that we now need as the spiritual children of our Heavenly Father. As children, we submitted, though sometimes fairly reluctantly we submitted, to the discipline administered by our parents. Now, our parents attempted, by their discipline, to help us develop character and behavior that would allow us to peacefully interact with others in this present cosmos, in this physical world. We need to know how to get along with other people so that somebody doesn't bash our head in or whatever. So our parents are trying to make sure that we can fit in to this world. That's what we were trained. That's what they were trying to do, is get us in that direction. Since the training we receive from our spiritual father is for the development of godly character and righteous conduct so that we can enter into the realm of spirit, our response to him should be unwavering submission, something we didn't always give to our physical parents. Because we question sometimes, the reason for discipline. In fact, Paul goes on, verse 10, Revised English Bible, they disciplined us for a short time as they thought best. Sometimes we knew that it wasn't really for our best, that something else was at work in the way we were being disciplined. The length of human childhood is very, very short. Didn't seem like it when we were children. See, I'm like, time just drug. It took forever. I'm waiting till I'm 6. I'm waiting till I'm 8. I'm looking forward to being 10. But when you have children, what happened? They were babies, and now, they're adults. What's gone on? This is impossible. But childhood is very, very short. And because it is so short, our parents had only a very few years to train us and to discipline us. They administered discipline as they thought best, Paul says here in verse 10, the Revised English Bible. Sometimes they disciplined us just like their parents disciplined them. At other times, They disciplined us because they were upset about some personal problem, and they took their frustration out on us. They needed to go out and bang a bat against a hay bale or something, but the paddle on us would suit them just fine. Okay, so sometimes that's what was done. Other times, we got it because some other sibling did it and pinned the problem on us. But they thought best. They were working with limited knowledge, limited understanding of what was going on. So sometimes you get framed, and then you suffer because you've been framed. And then at other times, they were justified in the correction they dispensed. They did a real good job. But you had this variation. And that's why he says, as they thought best. Human parents are imperfect. They are simply imperfect. They make mistakes. I've made mistakes as a parent. We've all made mistakes. Verse 10 goes on, Revised English Bible, but He, the Father in heaven, He does so for our true welfare, so that we may share His holiness. God, our spiritual Father, our heavenly Father, never, ever makes a mistake. He has never erred in His correction. Every time He corrects us, He does it for our good. He's guiding us toward eternal life by correcting us whenever we begin to deviate from the narrow path that leads to life, where very few find that path. Verse 11, the Complete Jewish Bible translates, now, all discipline, while it is happening, does indeed seem painful, not enjoyable. But for those who have been trained by it, it later produces its peaceful fruit, which is righteousness. Or the New English translation has the fruit of peace and righteousness. Correction generally takes us by surprise. It's kind of unexpected. All seems to be going well, then we're confronted with the fact that we have failed to take the proper course. We have put our foot in the wrong place, going in the wrong direction. We have failed to accomplish what was expected of us, and so as a result, now we have to retrace our steps and get back to the place on the path from which we strayed. It's not enjoyable to be shown our failures. However, if we learn from our mistakes and are careful to avoid the decisions and conduct that caused us to fail, we should never then repeat that failure. Our future conduct should produce the good fruit of righteousness rather than the bad fruit of failure and unrighteousness. Verse 12. So now that he's gone through the importance of being corrected and recognizing that God is doing it, therefore, verse 12, strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees. The point has been made that much of the suffering experienced by God's children is due to the need for correction and not because God has deserted them. Oh, woe is me, God has deserted me. Look at all the problems that have come. No, God's got His paddle out sometimes, and we need to pay attention. We need to learn. Paul now returns to his analogy that he began at the first of this chapter. He returns to the analogy of the life that we live being like a long-distance race, kind of a cross-country run, if you will. In this race, we must hold fast our grip on the truth that God has given us. Again, strengthen the hands which hang down. Yes, these hands have got to grasp and hold firmly, not be limp and hang down, but to hold firmly to the truth. and the feeble knees. Strengthen the feeble knees. That is, we must continue standing without wavering on the foundation of faith. There can be no wavering in that faith. We've got to be convicted. So, don't let the knees get feeble so that you can't stand. Don't let the hands get limp so that you can't hold on. And make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be dislocated, or King James has, may not be turned out of the way. The Lamsa translation has that it may not, that what is lame may not go astray, but rather be healed. Now, verse 13 is a paraphrase. I want to go back and read it from Proverbs. This is a paraphrase of Proverbs 4, verses 26 and 27. Proverbs 4, verses 26 and 27. Here we read, "Ponder the path of your feet." Ponder the path of your feet. That is, meditate about the direction of your life. Ponder the path of your feet. Let all your ways be established. That is, you need to make sure that you know the path. And you need to make sure that every step is firmly established. Do not turn to the right or to the left. Remove your foot from evil. In other words, you've got to stay on the straight path. Now, in order to make certain we stay on the right path, we must carefully consider every step we take. If this admonition is followed and our ways are established by being deeply rooted in God's truth, then any time we may stumble and become spiritually lame, we will not, according to what this proverb says, we will not go astray from God's way, but we will be healed of our spiritual lameness. Once we're lame, we're not able to move with the same speed. We are slowed down. That's what it's talking about. You don't want to be slowed down and then fall off the path. You may be slowed down, but you will be healed if you stay on the path. It's imperative that in our race of life, we stay alert and maintain the course God reveals to us in His Word. Prayer, study, meditation, the power of God's Spirit are essential to staying on the difficult and narrow path that leads ultimately to eternal life. John 7, verses 14, 15, where Jesus talks about how the narrow way, the very difficult gate to get through, and the very narrow way to go after getting through. Verse 14, pursue peace with all men. Actually, men is inserted. Pursue peace with all, with everyone. All who have been selected at this time to be under the terms of the new covenant are to be peacemakers. Jesus tells us, blessed are the peacemakers, back in Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. So, we have an obligation under that covenant to be peacemakers, not warmongers. But in the Church of God, you look across this group, that group, the other group, and it seems that there are those who are dead set on being warmongers. But then they're not going to be called the children of God if that's the case. Just as a heads up. Pursue, it says. Peace does not simply happen. Peace requires effort. We must pursue it. The way in which we are to pursue peace is by obedience to God. That's the way peace is pursued. In Proverbs 3, verse 1, my son, do not forget my law, but let your heart keep my commands, or my commandments, the King James has, for length of days and long life and peace they will add to you. Your life will be peaceful. In Psalm 119, Psalm 119, verse 165, great peace have those who love your law. That's the law of God, the Ten Commandments, what he's talking about here. By keeping God's law, and in particular, the last 6 of the Ten Commandments, we exhibit our concern for the welfare of others, which generally leads to peaceful relationships. When people know, hey, I'm not going to steal from you, I'm not going to murder you, I'm not going to do this or hurt you or whatever, I'm not going to thrash you and do this, that. Hey, I'm all for being peaceful neighbors with you. But, if they sense that, you're out to get them, you're out to destroy them, you're out to take what's theirs, you're coveting everything they have, etc., then you're not going to be at peace. So if we keep the commandments, great peace we will have. Now, we are warned, though, Paul tells us back in Romans chapter 12, verse 18, that it doesn't always happen. There are many people in this present world, in this cosmos, who refuse to be peaceful no matter how much effort we expend. If possible, Paul tells us back in Romans chapter 12, if possible, live at peace with all men. Some won't let that happen. But we must be the peacemaker. We must initiate it. Okay, pursue peace with all men. Verse 14 goes on, and holiness. Pursue holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. Holiness, which is the condition of being set apart for God's purpose, requires effort, just like peace. Holiness doesn't just happen. It requires expenditure of effort. In order to reach the realm of spirit, we must be set apart from this present world and the accepted standards of this world. We have to be apart from that. We must consciously reject this world and seek first God, His righteousness, and His kingdom. Matthew 6:33. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Seek first these things within the pure in heart, who again, Jesus tells us, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. So within the pure in heart, none of the unholiness of this world is found. It's not there. You don't find the unholiness that's in this present cosmos in the heart of one who is pure in heart. And that's what we must be. The pure in heart are those who possess the holiness. Verse 15, looking diligently, lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness or some poisonous root, Goodspeed has, springing up, cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. Or, Complete Jewish Bible, thus contaminates many, this bitter root. Now, Phillips translates this differently, and I think probably, I believe anyway, a little more accurately from what follows. Be careful that none of you fails to respond to the grace of God. For if he does, if he does not respond to the grace of God, there can spring up in him a bitter spirit, which can poison the lives of many others. Now, again, very clearly, there are two different emphases given in this verse. Now, I've chosen the New King James and Phillips, but you can go to other translations and find that there are basically two ways that this verse could be looked at. In the New King James, looking diligently lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. In the New King James, Paul seems to, the way it's rendered, seems to repeat his admonition from verse 2. about looking to Jesus as the goal on which we are to fix our gaze so that we don't wander away from God's holiness, become bitter, and spiritually hurt others. In the Phillips translation, be careful that none of you fails to respond to the grace of God, the charis of God. For if he does, there can spring up in him a bitter spirit which can poison the lives of many others. So in the Phillips, the way it is translated, Paul gives a warning regarding a gift, a charis, that God has given, which must be heeded in order to prevent being spiritually overthrown. Want to be spiritually overthrown? Then ignore this gift. Among the many gifts God has given His children, the Holy Spirit is the most critical. God's favor, obviously, His charis, His favor, that's one way. Charis is favor, His favor. He looks differently at us, just as He looked differently at Moses than He did Pharaoh. He looks differently at us than He does other people in this world because He's not dealing with them at this time as far as salvation is concerned. But the gift of God's Spirit, it's critical, absolutely critical. Failing to respond to being led by the Spirit of God. Remember Romans 8:14, as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the children of God. So we must be led by that Spirit. We must understand when God is helping us by that Spirit to see that we need to make a change. We need to alter our conduct or our thoughts. We need to respond to that. Failing to respond to being led by the Spirit of God amounts to quenching the Spirit. 1 Thessalonians 5:19. Quench not the Spirit. It is by the power of God's Spirit that we can keep our minds under control and bring every thought into captivity to the obedience of Jesus Christ who lives in us. But we can't do it. We can't bring every thought into captivity without the Spirit of God. And so God is leading us by that Spirit, but we've got to respond to it. Without that power, we are incapable of keeping our thoughts under control. And it is at such times that we don't control our minds that Satan is given opportunity. Remember in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 27, we're warned, don't give the devil, the diablos, any opportunity. But we do that when we don't use His Spirit. We give him opportunity to inject his bitter spirit, and once present, bitterness spreads rapidly, spiritually damaging all that it comes in contact with. And so, again, be careful that none of you fails to respond to the grace of God. You better use that Spirit or you're going to lose it. You lose that Spirit and you have lost eternal life. Verse 16. So, he tells us in verse 15, don't neglect that gift of the Spirit of God. Secondly, he says, and that there be no immoral. Complete Jewish Bible actually better translates the Greek here, sexually immoral. That's what it's talking about. That there be no sexually immoral or godless person like Esau who sold his own birthright for a single meal. It's important that the fellowship of God's children should not be contaminated by those who are practicing sexual immorality. Paul dealt with that. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, the first 5 or 6 verses. There was an individual, a young man who was committing some type of sexual immorality. Paul says, get him out of there, kick him out. It's not to be. You're not supposed to allow that to happen. And so that's all he's saying here. And so, within the fellowship, you shouldn't have one who is actively engaged in sexual immorality, or anyone that, or any individuals who are openly disrespectful of and have no regard for God or the things of God. That's what Esau was. He was profane. He had no respect for God. He had no regard for the things of God. Esau saw absolutely no value in his birthright and the inheritance associated with that birthright. That birthright was passed down from his grandfather Abraham to his father Isaac, and then it was his. It's his right of birth. And what was the inheritance that was promised to Abraham? Phenomenal inheritance. And that was Esau's. But he sold the birthright to Jacob for a bowl of stew and a slice of bread or whatever. That was it. That was all it was worth. He was profane, godless, because he didn't have any respect whatsoever for what God had committed to Abraham, which was passed to Isaac and was passed to him as a right of birth. For you know, verse 17, you know that afterward when Esau wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance. Or the New Living Translation, it was too late for repentance. The Revised English Bible says, a change of mind. He was rejected. It was too late for repentance. It was too late for a change of mind, though he sought it diligently with tears. Sometime after Jacob bought Esau's birthright, Jacob then turned around and deceived Isaac, his father, into decreeing the blessing that would normally belong to the firstborn on him instead of his brother. Now, Jacob did that, and did it because of the urging of his mother, but, again, it happened. When Esau discovered Jacob's theft, he begged Isaac to rescind what he had done and bless him instead. Father, change your mind. But Isaac refused to change his mind. Once decreed, there was no way to reverse or rescind the blessing. Could not be done. Once uttered, it was done. There was no way that he could take the blessing away from Jacob. In fact, in the following chapter of Genesis, Isaac reaffirmed that blessing. Even after he knew that Jacob had taken it, then he made certain he repeated it to Jacob. He blessed Jacob, then he sent him away. But he blessed him so that there was no question in anyone's mind that blessing belongs to Jacob. The lesson from Esau that we're given here in the context of this material, the lesson from Esau is that we must treasure the birthright position that we hold as being part of the first fruit who will inherit the realm of spirit at the first resurrection. Failing to do so could result in our losing the blessings of God, which once lost, as Esau found out, can never be recovered. So that brings us to the close of verse 17, a good breaking point, and next time then we will hopefully be able to complete